Okay. Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Eduardo Campos to these conversations. I'm Michael Diamond, Academic Director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department at NYU's School of Professional Studies, and Eduardo is a good friend of the school's, having been in our classroom on several occasions. But he's also a strategist of note, a professor himself, a former captain in the Brazilian Army. He's a cybersecurity expert, consultant to Microsoft, and an author of an excellent book about structured problem solving and generating solutions. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome Eduardo to this series of conversations. And perhaps I'd ask you, Eduardo, just first tell us a little bit about your story and your background and how you started to pull all these different threads together in your life.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael. I started as a technical professional. When I left the Army after 14 years, I pursued a career in computer science. I took a master's degree, and then several post-grad courses. But I went and worked in cybersecurity for Embraer. It's a airplane manufacturer that Boeing is negotiating the acquisition. And then I moved to the US to work for Microsoft, spent 13 years there. But what I learned along the way is not only the technical skills are important, it is, and I'm a people person. I like to engage with the teams. I always had teams which were recognized by their performance, and the formula was always to support them, to enable them. When you hire someone that can replace you in a few years, it's you are hiring the right people. And then I left Microsoft in 2016 and to create my own consulting company. Wrote a book with Forbes Books and with my wife, and I'm very happy leading, driving, and helping clients to find solutions for complex problems.
So I imagine in that sort of healthy journey through some quite diverse, situations, companies, experiences, you've seen a lot of examples of leadership, especially under times of crisis in the past. And I guess I wondered if you could reflect a bit with us on what you have seen happen in the past and how you've seen different people, different companies respond to crisis, whether it's SARS or 9/11 or economic downturns or a whole set of issues probably underway in Brazil when you were there, etc. Cybersecurity issues, whatever. It just be interesting to reflect a little bit on the past and what you've seen.
Yeah, I have experiences in the technical side, on the technical side, and not so technical side. But for people that were there working with technology in the early 2000s, there was the I Love You virus crisis. It was something new because it started happening in New Zealand, and a friend of mine working for an international bank called me in Sao Paulo, Brazil, 6 a.m., 7 a.m. and said, something is happening. Our bank is getting attacked, and it seems that it's widespread. It's in Australia now and in New Zealand, and be prepared. So I started calling people, and nobody knew anything. Internet was not as widespread as today, especially in Brazil in the early 2000s. But we were prepared. When we got to the office, 7 a.m., we were all prepared, and then we started managing the crisis as any crisis, putting people together, listening to all the opinions. But it's important when you face a crisis to stop the hemorrhage. The first thing you do, and sometimes you do that, taking not the best decision, but the decision that is possible to make. And then from there, you start working on the crisis and logging every action and assessing with the team. But what is important is to be prepared for the crisis,
Right,
not
right.
only when the crisis happens. So there are several jokes now on the internet about COVID-19 and technology adoption. Many cartoons showing executive level meetings and where the CEO is saying digital transformation is just a fad. This is gonna go away. We don't need that in our company now. Was
Right, 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 right,
right
right.
before the crisis, and
Yeah,
now
yeah, yeah.
everybody's online, and
Yeah,
people are complaining about lack of bandwidth, about our company's infrastructure is not
right,
ready. You need to be prepared
right,
for the crisis before it happens, because it may become an opportunity. If you are the only one in your sector or in your region that is prepared to serve your clients throughout the crisis, then you will succeed. But that was my technical
right.
experience with
But I guess it begs the question a bit, Eduardo, about what, it does seem like many institutions, governments, companies even, are actually relatively unprepared for this. And it seems to me it begs two questions. Either this is really an unprecedented, uh, you know, virus, pandemic, etc., or event in human history, which nobody could have prepared, or for all the good counsel and advice you've just given, people still ignored it and just didn't get prepared. I mean, so I wonder, do you think companies generally had done a good earnest effort to get prepared, and this is just sui generis, there's nothing like it, or do you think people didn't heed the good counsel?
I believe it's in many cases is to be unprepared, because if you look at the enterprise risk management reports from the World Economic Forum, for example, from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, from all the big companies that are issue risk management reports, the McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and so on,
Yep.
you're going to find that in the analysis, the risk assessments they do, and the recommendations, that a pandemic is a low probability, low
Mm,
likelihood to happen,
mm,
but with high impact. When you have
mm.
high impact events, you don't need to be fully prepared at once. You don't need to have everything in place, but you need to figure out if, in the likelihood that high impact event happens, what should we do? So
Right.
what I see today, talking to clients and reading and following what's happening, I am the director of education for ISACA Seattle, the chapter here. ISACA is a professional association for cybersecurity audit, information security, information systems audit, risk management professionals. When you talk to our members, what I hear is that many of their companies were not even thinking of it. It could be a pandemic. It could be the CEO passing away, like
Mm,
it
mm.
happens once in a while. We hear about CEOs that are passing, and anybody they didn't have a succession plan. So you need to be prepared, even if it's low likelihood. You're not going to have everything in place, but you need to test. You need to
Right.
simulate, and then when it happens, it's going to hurt. But at least you are prepared to face what's coming. What are the options you have? And even when you have a plan, you might fail.
Mm.
But at least you did your best on behalf of your community, on behalf of your citizens, on behalf of your shareholders.
It makes me wonder, actually, and maybe take it into a domain obviously you have deep expertise in, is away from the medical pandemic, but do you think we're prepared for a major cyber attack or crisis, that might cripple the country in a way that this disease has? Arguably, by we've taken certain decisions that we are in charge of those decisions about social distancing and in the interest of public health and safety, but it is a crisis that sort of descended upon us and spread very quickly, not dissimilar perhaps from some kind of cyber attack. Are we Are we ready? Have people learned any lessons, perhaps in the cyber world, that they're not exhibiting here?
We have several organizations in the private sector and the public sector that are prepared. They have tabletop exercises, that is, once in a while, assembling a group of experts in their organization or in their community, and practicing an exercise like it happened in the real life. But what I don't you don't need to take my word for that. The government agencies here are saying that we are not prepared as we should. Uh, the big consulting companies, the big think tanks are saying the same. If you take the World Economic Forum that I like to refer to, because they have a very good enterprise risk management approach for strategic risks, everybody's saying we are not prepared. I was having a discussion last week with a group of cybersecurity professionals, risk managers, and we all hope that this lesson is going to make the C-suite and the executive level in government agencies to really wonder, what if this was a cyber attack? And we are discussing how to approach this conversation. We can talk about a virus. It's not going to be it's going to be part of the scenario, but it's not only a virus attack that is going to happen. But instead of talking about a hacking attack or a criminal attack, we have to tell them about the virus, because this is in their mind. But definitely, we could be better prepared. We have exceptions where organizations in private and public sector are prepared, and some of them are really prepared. Right. But the majority they do not even have infrastructure to run Zoom meetings, because they do not have bandwidth, or they didn't think of having computers. I saw a case. I know several are happening where the organization didn't have even a standard operating system, so they had several different types of operating systems that were not talking to each other, the different versions. They never thought of connecting everything, and now they are facing issues because everybody's working from home.
Right. Well, I think, one of the other, challenges, perhaps for many of us, is, in some sense, this is, what has been defined in other places as a wicked problem. Yes, in that there aren't really simple solutions. It's not purely a scientific fact, or at least there are quite complex trade-offs that you have to make between, the economy and people's health and safety, between risk and opportunity, etc. And indeed, some very untested and unknowable potential solutions. So it really is a challenging problem. There's no answer. I'm wondering, given your great work in this area of sort of structured problem solving, and I know particularly you have a framework in the book, and the framework you teach, the ideas framework, whether and how we might start to apply some of that structured thinking or approach to problem solving, whether you've reflected on that at all.
Yeah, the complex problem solving is critical in times like we live today, because for the wicked problem, we call complex problem, but it's the same thing here, the same approach. That is, you have several different problems compounded, creating a bigger problem. You have to peel the onion to find the root cause or the root causes, and then go for solving for the root cause, not for the symptoms. That it's the main mistake. Also, you have a myriad of solutions, possible solutions. So there's no a best solution. There is a solution that solves for the biggest number of problems that we have at hand. You need to find ways to prioritize the problems. Which problem to tackle first? The other thing that people forget is how to engage everybody that is part of the solution and part of the problem. We call stakeholder mapping, that is a
Hmm.
known technique. But you need to understand what people want to do because they say they want to do, and what they actually want to do because they feel in they have in their minds that it's a what we call the consider all the motivations on the table and under the table. And sometimes people don't even realize, the stakeholders don't even realize that they have a hidden motive for not making a decision. It's not because they're hiding something. It's because
Mm.
they had a bad experience in the past. I had a case where uh, the chief marketing officer didn't want to sign a project, but he wouldn't say no. For weeks, I was there in his office presenting the project and so on. And he said, "Oh, this is great, let's do it, but not today." And he kept postponing until I stopped by his executive assistant desk, and we became friends because I was there every week. And she told me, this project is very similar to one that Mr. CMO approved 3 years ago. I said, "Oh yeah, tell me more about that." And then I learned that it was a complete failure.
Right.
The external consultant came, promised many things, signed the project, and went away and sent several junior people to execute it. And the CMO was in trouble. He was almost got fired by the CEO.
Mm.
So he was afraid that I was going to do the same. So we went back to our company. I was working for a large consulting company at that time. And we sat down with the partner and we put together a series of actions to counter his objections about costs skyrocketing, about people not delivering on time, and so on. And we went back and presented to him without telling him, "Oh, I know that you almost got fired." No, we just showed to him, here are some actions that we believe that could help us to get more visibility of what might happen, what might not happen in the future. He signed it immediately. So it was in his mind that
Right.
he failed. He didn't want to fail again.
Right.
So
Right.
in this is in these situations where we are solving complex problems, projects that are multi-year projects, we need to really put in place a structure, identifying the root cause that are what we're calling the ideas, and designing options because your solution might not be the best. Listening to the stakeholders mapping them, you might, like it happened with the executive assistant, there was not even our map because she didn't have any decision making power.
Right.
But lessons learned. We always talk to people that are the influencers. They influence the influencers. It's important to engage the stakeholders. The E from ideas, and then act, because one thing that is worse than not having a plan is not to executing the plan. It's just having a beautiful PowerPoint where it never goes anywhere.
Right.
And then finally, something that also many organizations forget is that is sustain. So ideas, IDEAS, sustain a solution. When you are designing a solution for a complex problem, think ahead of time how you are going to create feedback loops time to time to reconvene the stakeholders and reassess, are we doing well, are we getting there? Because especially with the complex problems, the problem evolves over time and the solutions have to evolve dynamically over time, otherwise it's just a nice to have. So if you have a structured approach, I'm not saying that everything is going to be rosy, but at least you will ensure that you did your best to peel the onion, go for the root cause, engage the right people, and sustain whatever you recommended.
Is it fair to say, Eduardo, though, what certainly at the the federal government level, but even at the level of big companies are facing is not a problem, but a series of problems with different root causes? Yes, that it's a question of how those things all come together. Yeah, so businesses, I think, will face a series of decisions. Perhaps some of them are contingent, and perhaps others are, separate. But you've got a complex interplay of different issues and problems that you've got to solve.
Yes.
How does the model? So there's no a root cause. We're not looking for a root cause. We're looking for individual root causes for individual problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and you are completely right. And that's what when we are young professionals, just starting full of energy, trying to really make a point and get on with our careers, we make mistakes, assuming that there's one root cause and that our solution is going to be better than the discovery of the sliced bread. So we need to understand that the perfect is going to be an enemy of the good, especially in government and even in not-for-profit sector, where you have so many stakeholders, you have the political views, you have different interests. You need to really plan for the big thing, but achieve the one to two things that are going to make a difference, and will bring you one step forward to the scenario you want to have.
Right.
So you drive changes in a slower pace, but in a way that you move from point A to point B, but you ensure that you are going to get to a strong point B. And some public leaders, public sector leaders, are very good with that. I work a lot with academia, and I have mentors that are really good with that. I had a dean in our grad school, and she taught me so much. She still teaches me today with her role model, and she's always thinking of how she's going. She calls three-dimensional chess. So what are all dimensions that matter to go from A to B, even if it takes longer? As young professionals, we try to go very fast, but sometimes we need to adjust our pace, our passion, our energy to what is possible.
Yeah.
And public sector offers, government offers several opportunities of career, not only the private sector. And I work a lot with the public sector and with governments, and we have leaders, we have opportunities that are there, and then the young professionals sometimes say, "No, this is going to be too slow for me," but it's so rewarding because
Right.
in governments you can see the changes that you drove really impacting the lives of so many people. It is the sense of accomplishment. I work with young professionals that are working for government, and they are so delighted, but they were capable of going for one to two changes, slower pace, but really strong scenarios that they got to. And from there, they are going to move to the next one or two steps, the next one to three steps, and keep going.
Yeah, one of the things I'm finding fascinating is that even whilst we're in this sense of heightened anxiety for many people, legitimately, because of personal safety issues and economic well-being, we also seem to be giving each other a little bit of space to test and experiment and fail, or at least test, experiment, and things not being perfect. Back to your earlier comment about perfect is the enemy of the good. I've been curious about that, just watching even in forums like this, in all these various Zoom webinars that people have been putting up. They don't need to be as polished. We don't need to have all the answers. We're just out there, responding, experimenting, and I think that's probably a healthy thing, that there's a sort of vulnerability that's been exposed, which is the pop psychologists have told us for a long time, we need to be more in touch with all of that. So I want to segue a little bit, if we could, Eduardo, and I asked you to do something which I'm never really a big fan of, which is these listicles, top 5 things, top 3 things. But if you had to, or as you are today, advising many people, what are the top 3 or 5 things you're telling people today that as leaders, or perhaps either in technology or whatever, that you're telling people they should be focused on or they should be doing right now?
The first thing I'd say and I just said that to a client of mine last week, that leaders should do in this moment we are living, and that we don't know when it's going to get better for real, is to focus on people. We tend, especially you were talking about this in the beginning of our conversation, that we've been working nonstop from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. over Zoom. Especially in your case, my case, we have connections abroad, so we follow the sun. So when it's morning here, it's night somewhere else, and when it's evening here, is just starting Singapore. We have to focus on people, because this non-stop onslaught of Zoom meetings and connections all the time and email is burning out our teams. So we need to focus on people. This is the first thing. It's create a safe environment where people can feel that they have a holding space where they can vent, where they can share the challenges they're facing with the homeschooling nonstop at home, with issues of not finding even simple items of grocery in the grocery store. That we ensure that we are achieving our goals, the organizational goals. But I saw leaders in the last several weeks that are driving forward the same pace they were before, no matter how much roadkill they will leave behind. They will get there. But then when they look behind, nobody's gonna be there. People will
Right.
leave.
No, I think that's fascinating. That's a really astute observation about leadership right now. Is there's probably a high, I mean, if there was some kind of graph that we could draw, there's a heightened degree of desire to be action oriented and, keep momentum going forward. And obviously much of that's quite legitimate because businesses are facing really existential problems, so it's appropriate for leaders to be thinking about, how do I rescue some growth and stability out of this, and or accelerating projects, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There's still the human element of that, which is you're then asking a group of people to follow you when they have on their mind more than the usual set of concerns and anxieties, or broader human interests and needs that they have to service. I think, I think one of the, this is perhaps a more philosophical existential point, but I think one of the challenges that, a lot of, we're not pausing to understand perhaps how profound this is for all of us, psychically. It's just a very challenging time for us all psychically. We're dealing with matters, let's be candid, of life and death, and we're channeling our energies perhaps in ways we think are productive. But it's absolutely fair to say we should be pausing a bit more and reflecting. I appreciate that point.
Yes. And if we don't do this intentionally, it will not happen. So I have a case where the executive decided that in during the day they will have the water cooler moments. It's people have a 15-minute break. If they are online, they can go and they can talk about anything, and they can share pictures, they can share videos. And you are not required to go. So some people in the beginning didn't show up. They said, "Oh, it's too many online opportunities today." But then, bit by bit, people realized that it was an opportunity to replicate what we have in the normal life, when people go to grab a coffee in the kitchen, and they stop to talk about something, about the game that is coming, or about something that happened with the kids.
Mm.
And but it is in the calendar. It is there. A 15-minute break. Everybody's required to take a 15-minute break that time of the day. I don't know what you're gonna do, but
Right.
if you decide, you come here and we'll talk. So we need to do that, and because I learned that in the army, when you are going through I don't know, a 40-mile march that you have to get to to the targets, and then you from there on, it's going to be we are going to have a fight or something. You need to ensure that throughout those 40 miles, you have everybody together. And when you stand up and say, go, let's go, everybody goes with you. Otherwise, you're going to stand up and say, go, and nobody's going to follow you. You need to take care of your team first. You need to take care of people that will be there with you when this situation goes away, because not forever. The second thing that I'd say is listen to your clients. Listen to who is helping you to survive today, and who will be there with you if you care about them. Again, it's about mapping stakeholders. It's about mapping the interests, mapping the objections, understanding how you can be helpful instead of asking for help. That's normal for us human beings. Ask how you can help. And as we were talking earlier, it's not offering um, fully baked solutions or answers. It's helping to ask the right questions. Is guiding your clients to ask the right set of questions. And it's more about coaching than giving the fully baked solution, because we as experts, especially in cybersecurity technology, we try to give the fully baked solution because after all, we are the experts. But people don't need fully baked advice. They need help in figuring out how to get there. That's my second recommendation. A third recommendation is step back and go. There's a technique Heifetz in his book says go to the balcony. If you are he does makes an analogy. You are familiar with that with a ballroom. If you are dancing on the dancing floor with your spouse, with your significant other, it's one situation. If you go a flare of steps and from the balcony have a look at the dancing floor, you're gonna see a different scenario. You're gonna see the band playing. You're gonna realize that there's another place to get your glass of wine that you didn't know about it. You're gonna see that there's some drunk people at the counter. There's someone's in the center. There's one by the door, and then from there you start rethinking how people interact with each other, how the problems that are playing might have a different perspective, and then you must go back to the dance floor to make the decisions. But it's important that you take a look at the ecosystem, your partners, your the influencers. In your case, could be the government, the tax authority, the real estate agency in the government that is going to give you permits to build your new complex condominium complex. But you need to take into consideration the ecosystem. And because we are in a crisis, and as you said, we are all realizing that we are mortals. Because it's scary to see that I live in Seattle, so and I live in Kirkland, where actually the COVID-19 outbreak really got really ugly in the beginning. Today it's under control, very well cared, but it was really ugly 8 weeks ago, and people are freaking out. So the first thing you need to realize is people, your team. Also think of your clients. Think about the ecosystem. And also, a fourth recommendation I give is think of yourself. Not necessarily in this order, but think of yourself. We all have to realize, and I believe with the situation we are living now, it's happening, that we are not superhumans. We are not superheroes. We need to set time for our own self-healing, for our own care, because we cannot be there all the time. It's important more than ever to have a hobby, to take your mind off, and to sometimes when you are fixed on something, you are staring at the computer 10 hours a day, then you just go to the window and look outside. Now it's springtime. Many places across the globe on the north hemisphere is springtime. So go and have a look, and take your eyes off the problems they are facing. When you come back, you're gonna have a different perspective. And finally, what I recommend is try to plan for the best, but accept what you accomplished. Celebrate your achievements. The perfect is the enemy of the good. What I took from my experience working with the startups um, for the last almost 10 years is you need to go initially for the MVP, the minimum viable product. The minimum. It's not perfect. It's your baby, but it's not perfect. But it is beautiful. It is what you have. Celebrate that. Down the road, you have to pivot to something else. You have to make that MVP and that minimum viable product become something else. No problem. But at least celebrate that. We need to stop, breathe, take a breath, and celebrate, especially during this crisis time. That's
Yeah.
I hope this is helpful.
No, they're very, very powerful words, and I think a lot of the personal reflections will resonate significantly with people listening in. I hope, especially leaders. C-suite leaders often probably put as much pressure on themselves as their organizations or the environment does, and we see a lot of burnout among leadership because they're trying to take too much on and not probably taking those pauses for themselves. And I've always believed it comes out of a sense of responsibility and accountability, not some sort of hero feeling. But either way, that's a lot for individuals. As you said, we're all flawed or limited individuals in some way or another. I wanted to come back because it's a good segue to the point about perspective and the lovely analogy about the ballroom and the balcony. I think it was Einstein who said no problem can be solved at the level it's experienced. Yes, that you have to shift your perspective to solve problems. And I think indeed this notion of going back and forth is probably actually the right analogy. That you need to take the learnings from the balcony back onto the dance floor and up and down. But in that context, and you spoke, I think, very eloquently about helping clients frame questions as much as developing answers. Can we talk a little bit about the future and what you see as some of the important emerging trends? And I, as you and I chatted about a little bit before this conference call. I've relaxed that question a little bit. I've typically been asking people, what's the answer? What is changing? What will have changed? And I think that's, the real answer, the honest answer to that question is nobody knows. So I'd reframe the question, which is, what trends do you see emerging that in terms of consumer behavior or attitudes or beliefs, that you think we ought to be watching? And perhaps to your point about building capabilities, what should organizations be doing to ensure that they are able to identify the signal from the noise?
Yeah, you have a good point here. It's important to look at trends, but I like the way you approach it. In NYU, I believe it's part of the culture. It's not about predictions. It's about trends. It's about trends assessment. And there's a slight difference here. It's not about trying to guess what's coming. It's about assessing how things evolve. It's different. When you make predictions, you just try to take a picture of the future. When you assess trends, you're watching the move to play out. You have a look at you must have a look at the past, and then you come with the video to the current situation. Then you assess how the past can repeat itself and how new factors will play out in what could potentially happen. So it's not about making predictions. It's about assessing how the situation is evolving. It's about designing scenarios that could happen or might not happen. I like to refer to the WordCamp forum. They have several leaders working in projects, risk management and skills gaps and so on. I also like the trends that Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey design and offer to their clients and to the public as a whole. And one thing that is common in these trends is the skills. Which skills will be necessary? So in your case, you are an academic institution. You have students that are going through the undergrad or grad school, and they're going to face a different scenario for in the job market. So one thing that all of the think tanks are saying is that more and more employers will expect more social and emotional skills. As a cybersecurity professional, in my young days as a chief information security officer or chief security officer, I made mistakes where I tried to solve every problem as a technical problem instead of realizing that there was more to it than just technology skills that were needed. So technology skills will be really critical in the future, much more than today. But as social and emotional skills, higher cognitive skills, where you are able to solve complex problems, you have critical thinking, and it's interesting that the definition that WordCamp Forum has for critical thinking, that it's that you use your logic and reasoning, and you identify strengths and weaknesses of options, of solutions, alternative solutions, and then you assess the conclusions. You assess ways to solve the problem. Are going to be those are going to be skills that are going much needed, but also very important today and in the future. That is leadership. It is communicating without jargon. Us technical people, we tend to talk in acronyms. Especially, I came from the army, acronyms, and assume that people know about what you are talking. So I remember talking about viruses in computer viruses and in the 20 years ago, and at the moment I stopped and told my I was the chief security officer and I had the chief information security officer reporting to me, and I told him stop. The CFO had he was lost, and he was staring at the future, and I said, Mr. CFO, what do you think? I said, first of all, start explaining to me why you are talking about viruses, and if you are talking about computing. And I'm not joking. This happens. This happens still today. There was a judge a few years ago that wanted to order the seizing of all computers in a corporation because they had viruses and that could infect people. This happens. You need to step back and and avoid jargon. So what the institutes are saying is go for the skills that are really necessary. Complex problem solving are going to be really necessary. Complex problem solving, what we've been talking about, critical thinking, how to think critically about potential solutions. Also, social skills, communication skills. There's a very interesting study um, that was carried out by two professors at West Point about what are the skills gap, what is the skill gap for cybersecurity professionals in the next several years. And it's not technical skills. It is social skills, communication skills, ability to listen to people. So you can hire professionals in cybersecurity today that have those skills, but not the majority. But you
Right.
can hire the best technical professionals and then train them, partner with your HR department, your training department, and train them on those skills
Yeah.
and prepare people. Also important in the future in the leadership skills is to be able to do what we've been talking in the first part of this conversation, that is peeling the problem in several layers and prioritizing the problems and addressing each one of the layers with a set of solutions instead of going thinking of the big picture. It's important. It's going to be more important than ever, but also addressing the several layers of the problem and prioritizing how to solve them. These are things that we are reading in the reports.
Right. No, I think what's so wonderful about what you just shared, Eduardo, is how transferable those insights are to different domains. So, maybe some of that work you were quoting directly out of West Point looked at cybersecurity. The same conversations are happening among CMOs. I was part of a CMO Growth Council at the ANA workshop around exactly this topic. What are those meta skills, mindsets, etc., that young emerging professionals need. I want to take us for a moment, and we have a few minutes left, perhaps to wrap up. But I'm quite interested in these potential fundamental changes to human behavior, attitudes, beliefs, etc. And I recognize the limitations of the question because what people say today is not probably extrapolatable. People don't really, we're in, if we ask the questions in classic consumer research terms today, you have to discount, I think, a lot of what people are saying. Even watching behaviors, you have to discount because a lot of what we're doing is not by choice. We've been compelled to stay at home. We've been compelled to do certain things. So there's a healthy debate already in the market research community about what is extrapolatable from current behavior, or certainly from qualitative research. But putting that aside, I think we could dimensionalize some areas that might be interesting, and perhaps you and I could spend a little bit of time speaking about one where you have some real knowledge, which is this issue of privacy, and the tension would be the tension between privacy and the value of the surveillance state. Yes, so to some extent, what many of us at least seem to be wanting to sign up for is, these testing regimes and a lot more, control to some extent over our liberties and movements and things like that, because the trade-off for us will be, improved health and safety, but we recognize we're giving up potentially some private information, or, as that discussion has played out over the last few years, how you do see some shift. Tell us a little bit about how you think that this debate is developing, especially in this time.
Now, there's an organization in the US, it's a global organization called IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals. And they are leading this conversation among their members. And it's really, I've been following that. A few years ago, I took their certification, and it's really interesting. The conversation is going on now. What we see is that it is, like you said, a trade-off. Today we have a crisis, and we have no vaccine for a virus for maybe a year to come. In one way that experts, public health experts are pitching, one way to live with that is to trace people that are infected, to avoid a reinfection or to avoid infecting people that are didn't have the disease yet. And one way to do that, to trace people, is to harvest their GPS location in applications. Google and Apple were the ones that are offering ways to do that, and there are some applications that are going on now being assessed. But it bears the question. It begs the question: what might happen if this is forever? Because people are concerned that they're going to give up their privacy now, and they are going to let someone that they don't know whom have access not only to their location, but the location of their peers, of their friends, the place they go, and then with that create a scenario where your life is fully mapped out from the morning to the evening, and you have no rights to no way to hide anymore, to feel that you can go anywhere. I hear a lot, oh, but I don't have anything to hide, I don't have anything to fear. Well, today you don't. But let's see, let's go back to and learn from history, as we spoke earlier. Let's look at the past to try and assess trends in the future. What happened in Europe between the 30s and 40s, and after and throughout the Second World War, where several governments were used the documentation that was in their archives to persecute people because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, and so on. That's why in Europe people are so, and they had, because of at that time they had practices in governments throughout Europe to have very detailed information about immigration, about the families, about the friends. So it was easy for the governments that were good and became evil to go and persecute people. So in Europe, people are much more concerned about privacy than here in the U.S., where it's the land of democracy and freedom, and we don't have to deal with that. So it is, there's no solution, I believe, now there's no answer for this kind of question. But I believe that we have all to be part of this conversation to assess the trade-off for how long, if it is reversible. Are we going to be able to recover your freedom of doing whatever you want and moving wherever you want, um, after you give up your data now? Or is your, oh, but it's anonymized? It's not.
Yeah.
It is anonymized.
Right.
But researchers show in several organizations show that it's possible to reconstruct the data and identify people. Maybe not everybody, but a big chunk of the database throughout time. So it is. I'd say that my recommendation is be part of the conversation. Do not say yes or no just because you are afraid. When electricity was brought to New York in centuries ago, 2 centuries ago, uh, uh, people were afraid of electricity. In privacy was one question. Now, your privacy is going to be affected because now you are with your boyfriend kissing on the bench in the park, and everybody's gonna see you. I'm not kidding. This was one of the headlines I saw in a presentation. So we need to, and electricity today is not seen as damaging us in any shape or form. So we need to be part of the conversation, understand actually what we are giving up, if it is reversible, and assess the several what if scenarios. What might happen? I give away my information today. Am I able to turn it off? And what's the damage? So we need to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. No, I think that is that's certainly true. I mean, the sad truth, and maybe we'll end on on one other topic, just because your thoughts are provocative. Unfortunately, we're talking actually in a week in which my understanding is protesters started lighting fires at the base of telecom towers in the UK because some conspiracy theory is out there that 5G is the cause of this coronavirus. And so the segue for me in my mind is while some of these technologies that do ultimately to prove to be perhaps innocuous and or much more to our advantage than our disadvantage, we live in a world in which our capacity to really find the signal in the noise and our respect for expertise, and that's the topic I think I'd like to close on, is really compromised in many cases. So my question to you, as someone who is clearly an expert and is trying to give good counsel, is what do you think the future feels like for scientists, experts? Are you now? Are people going to pause and say, those people have something to contribute, and we should listen to them, or we should have listened? Or apologies, where are people going to say, you know what, these experts have no idea what they're talking about, they're way too conservative, or they're way too alarmist, or whatever the phrase is, or actually they've got something to hide themselves? So give me some sense of where you think the role of experts and expertise might be going, and then we'll probably wrap and close around there. So
Yes, I saw the headlines, especially in the UK, and it happened in the past when we started the Industrial Revolution started, where the Luddites, they were destroying machines, and because they were against the progress for valid reasons or not. Um, when people fear what is coming, you need to give them more information, not less information. Science was never so important to be shared to all of us, with all of us, but in layman terms, we need to inundate the news, the internet with the information, and have better communicators, not only better scientists, but better communicators. I have one example that I love so much, that is when talking about astronomy, what Carl Sagan did in the past, talking in lay terms about the universe, and using the best technology at the time to do that, the TV waves. That is an example of what we need today. If we're talking about the future, that is scary if we think about the compounding technologies that are creating this um, fourth industrial revolution, driverless cars, blockchain, high-level encryption, quantum computing, uh, 5G, that are where the towers are being burnt to the ground. We need to step back as technology experts and really use the forums that we have on the internet and TV and everywhere we can to give more information. So I hear people saying, "Oh, if you don't understand science, if you're against science, you are stupid." No, it's because it is on us to the burden to explain in even simpler terms. Yeah, I know there's a point where you give up, because when someone doesn't want to really get it, because it's a personal stance, no problem. But you have to keep trying to explain. Like my example with electricity, with railroads that were faced the same problem. Uh, you have to explain to people, talk about the benefits, and like you were saying, it's more advantageous then the problems that are being brought to the surface. So what else can be done to satisfy those dissatisfied customers that are burning the towers, or is just anarchism and plain and simple and it's not going to have any solution. But at least you have to try, especially as a, a public official, as a government official, to explain to your constituents what is important. The same. Let's go back to your initial scenario with CMOs. If you are designing your best campaign ever, and your clients or the general public is really not getting it because you are too brilliant for them, might be your first thought. Try to step back and rethink what you are doing, because it's about communicating. It is about trying several ways to communicate the same idea. And in the case of 5G, maybe we went too fast, and we need just to slow down and explain better. I've heard the same complaint about regular cell towers in the past, and it seems today people are less concerned than in the past. But 10 years ago, we would hear that, oh, this is going to cause cancer and so on. And I'm not discarding people's concerns. I'm just saying that with more information that is available today, we can balance, we can weigh in the options of having the cell phone signals or not having the cell phone signals. It's a cost-benefit analysis. I believe that the same thing is needed in this case.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I think that we all of these things are proving to be more nuanced balancing acts. And I think that's probably where we'll leave the formal conversation. I want to thank you enormously for a very rich, broad conversation. It was a lot of fun to do. Yeah. And I guess I also feel it would go without saying that there's been a very human cost to this tragedy, and I want to just recognize that it's easy to sort of over intellectualize what is for many people a profound personal challenge or to their family and their friends, and just take a moment both to recognize those who've been lost and also to thank those who very much are in the front lines of supporting all of this, and helping us as a community. So in that spirit, from Connecticut or New York to Seattle, Washington, I want to thank Eduardo Campos very much for joining us today, and look forward to continued friendship and conversations in the future.
My pleasure. Count on me.